Welcome to Chapter 4, Consideration. This is a slightly more complicated chapter than previous chapters, and consideration is the third element in the required elements for a binding contract. Consideration is the thing that distinguishes a contract from a gift. If there's no consideration going both directions, then it's a gift, and a gift is not something that is enforceable by contract law, with some minor exceptions. Consideration is defined as something of legal value. It's a benefit conferred or a detriment incurred. It's a little more complicated to figure out the detriment, but we'll take a look at that. Sometimes we talk about quid pro quo when we talk about consideration, and that is consideration has to go both ways. You have to see an arrow going both directions for both parties in the contract, or it's a gift. Typically it's money, but it can be services. Picture buying coffee. You're exchanging money for coffee. So there's two sides, two kinds of consideration. It's going both directions. So it's a valid transaction. It's valid consideration. This is something I love to test on, and this is detriment is consideration. It's just the idea that somebody gives up something they had a legal right to, and that itself is consideration. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say Jimmy has some property and it's beautiful. He has a legal right to do whatever he wants as long as it's within the building codes and the laws of the state with that property. However, the Nature Conservancy really wants to turn it into a preserve. So they give him $20 million so that he will agree not to develop it. So in that case, he's giving up his legal right to do whatever he wants in exchange for $20 million, and that is a detriment incurred form of consideration. Another example is an option contract where the owner of the Seattle Storm says, okay, I won't sell it to anybody except the person who paid for the option to buy it. So they're limiting their right to sell it to everyone in exchange for money, if that makes sense. Can you think of a detriment incurred that might qualify for consideration in a contract? You try it. Here's a list of some things the book talks about being not consideration. They don't qualify, they don't rise to the level of consideration. And the theme here, if you look at these things, is that they're not really a valid exchange made at the time of the contract. So past consideration. Well, that's not part of the current deal. Moral consideration. Moral consideration is the idea that somebody gives something because they believe they have to. They feel like they have a moral obligation to give something. That itself is not binding. A court will not hold somebody to that just because they have guilt. A gift is clearly the opposite of a contract, so we need to really be aware of when situations are truly gifts. And the idea of an illusory promise is not consideration. That's the idea that you have a promise, but it doesn't really mean anything. There isn't really anything binding about it, nothing objective, nothing that a court could enforce. That's an illusory promise. And of course, if you are somebody who has a legal duty to do something, if you promise to do it, there's no new consideration. So what we're really aiming at here is something new that is intended as part of the current agreement. That's what we're aiming for. Think about this situation. This is pretty common. Someone gives you a ride home from school. When you actually get home, you say, hey, I'll give you some gas money. In that situation, the ride was essentially a gift. That transaction from getting you from place A to place B was a gift. And the promise to give gas money is after the fact. And since the consideration was not part of the original deal, it's called past consideration. So you have to be aware about the timing of consideration. Was it intended as part of the current deal? Here's another, perhaps dated example of past consideration, where you have somebody who agreed to give a loan, and then the husband later says, okay, I'll pay it back after the loan has been issued. That's not a promise that was taken into account at the time of the contracting, so it wasn't part of the deal. So that's past consideration. I like this example of moral consideration. Imagine a mom who's not the best, promising to give her child money for therapy later. Is that a binding promise? Well, why is Lucy doing it? Is Lucy making an exchange with the child? No, Lucy's just messing up her child. So Lucy is acting out of a moral sense of guilt or duty, and the court is not going to enforce that. Why, you say? It certainly seems fair for the child to get some money for therapy, but in this situation, the child is not giving any consideration. The mom is basically offering a gift. It's not enforceable, and the child isn't giving anything in exchange except suffering a horrible childhood. Now, if for some reason the child relied on that promise and maybe went out and hired a therapist, that might take it into the world of promissory estoppel, which we'll get to soon. You know, we like to talk about famous old cases in this class and FOCs, and one famous old case is Webb versus McGowan. I want you to stop this video and go take a look at that. And what you should really be getting from that is that the the summary talks about it being the minority rule, that sometimes moral consideration is enough. I actually think the trend is kind of pointing towards moral consideration being enough. So you have the existing old common law rule that it's not enough, and now maybe a current trend saying it is. So if you're ever faced with a case like this, you just need to make your best argument based on the existing case law. Certainly there's a fairness argument to saying that moral consideration is enough. In Webb versus McGowan, the gentleman was going to throw a block over an edge, and he realized someone was going to get hit by that heavy block, so he threw himself down in order to sway or swerve the block. And it did in fact miss the guy, but it hurt him. So the guy who was so grateful to have been spared by this block tumbling towards him offered to give him money and for the rest of his life. And then the guy who was saved died, and then the one who hurt himself tried to go after that promise, and the court in that case said, yeah, okay, he gave something. He gave his whole body in exchange for saving this guy's life. In that situation, we're going to count moral consideration. So the upshot is, old rule, not enough. Current trend may be enough. If you want to argue it, go to Webb versus McGowan and see if make sure you understand that case, because I could easily test on that. How is this blank filled in? Should be a gift. A gift can never be consideration. How do we fill in this blank? We say an illusory promise is not consideration. Illusory means it is just too vague. There's nothing that you could really pin the person down to. For example, if I choose to, I will buy your ranch. That's not really consideration, because you can't force the person to do that. They're not really committing to anything. So there's two ways you can fix these promises. One is called an output contract. So if I said, I will sell you everything I make out of my factory, that would be called an output contract. So the person buying doesn't have a set amount of how much they're buying, but they do have a way of measuring that. It's everything that the person made from their factory. That's called an output contract. There's another version of that called a requirements contract, and a requirements contract is when the buyer says, I will buy everything I need for my doll collection from you. So even though it's kind of vague, it's fixable. It's you can quantify what has to how it could be measured, the amount that could be measured. Another way you can kind of fix an illusory promise is to make it objectively quantifiable. So, for example, if I said, I will buy your stock at current market price, even though we don't have a price, current market price is something that could be quantified objectively. So it fixes something that's really squishy into something that is a little more concrete. So that's the point of that slide. And the thing that gets filled into this slide is called pre-existing duty situations are not valid consideration. In other words, if you have an obligation to do something under contract, you can't demand more money for those same tasks. You have to change the task, you'd have to either rip up the old contract, you'd have to do something to make it so there's valid consideration in that particular deal. Generally speaking, performing a legal duty that's already owed under a contract does not constitute consideration. So if you're a barista at Starbucks and your job is to pour espresso or make espresso for lattes, you can't demand more money for that particular task that you're under contract to do. Now, if they ask you to close the shop at night and that's not part of your normal duties, if that duty is doubtful or honestly disputed, as it says in this slide, if that's something that you aren't sure you have an obligation to do, then you can ask for more money for that. But you can't just demand more money for the same old task. Something has to change. Let's take the classic contractor situation. So the contractor gets in, is supposed to do work for $10,000, and then when he does the work, the homeowner says, "Nope, I'm only going to pay you $8,000." Assuming the contractor did what he was supposed to do, the contractor is owed the additional $2,000. In other words, one party to a deal cannot unilaterally change the consideration that is agreed to. That same analysis applies to the contractor now who wants more money. Again, the contractor is not entitled to change the consideration to an existing contract unless some other circumstance changes or the existing contract is ripped up and destroyed. You can kind of spot these cases by figuring out what just seems not right. Think about this situation. You've got a polygraph expert who asks a criminal about an unrelated crime during the administration of a polygraph. The criminal admits to the crime, and the employee then seeks the reward for finding the wrongdoer. So basically, the polygraph expert is getting something extra out of the deal, but they're already being paid for their job. Because they have a public duty to find out about crimes as part of their job, they don't get the reward that comes from turning that person in. That kind of makes sense, right? At a basic level, that makes sense? Now let's take that same contractor situation and look at what happens if they just basically rip up the original contract or modify the existing contract. I mean, as long as the parties are intentionally contracting to change the amount, that is okay. It's just that one party cannot unilaterally demand either more or the other party can't demand to pay less. So again, some ways around the legal duty rule is to rescind. That's a fancy legal word. That just means to turn back, to tear up. To rescind an existing contract is to return the parties to the position that they would have been in had they not contracted. It's like taking them back to ground zero. Rescission, that's an important word. I could easily test on that. And the idea of rescission is that it destroys the existing legal duty and lets them start from scratch in their negotiations. You can also have the idea of good faith, which is kind of a UCC concept. That's under the UCC. Again, that applies to the sale of goods, not services. The UCC is a different law that just applies to the sale of goods. Under the UCC, good faith is enough to justify a change in a contractual provision. As usual with any rule, there are exceptions. Here are some of the exceptions for when a pre-existing duty can be consideration. If new or different consideration is given, if you're trying to ratify a voidable obligation. This one is not clear in the book, so I'm going to ignore it. The duty is owed to a third person, not the promisee, and the unforeseen circumstances make the duty more difficult to fulfill. Okay, so we've already talked about the fact that you can't add to my job description here as a teacher without giving me additional consideration. You at least have an argument that the modification lacks independent consideration. But what about the situation where 24 students is 4 more than I agreed to teach? Or what if this was my 4th class and 3 was considered full-time? 3 met my contractual obligations. So under these circumstances, because there is a different duty, I may have a right to additional pay. Here's an example of ratifying avoidable obligation. Imagine that poor Chris bought a car when he was 17. It was voidable at that time. Until he turned 18, it was voidable. But when he turned 18, he then reconfirmed, or as we say in the law, ratified the contract. Although he was not getting any new consideration, the law says he's now legally bound to the contract. It's kind of a fairness argument. Where you have unforeseen circumstances that make the promise harder to perform, that could give grounds or reason to negotiate a modification. Let's look at Jimmy. He contracted to dig a big hole. He unexpectedly hit bedrock. As long as that risk was not assigned to Jimmy, in other words, Jimmy did not take on the risk of hitting bedrock in the contract, he could potentially negotiate a modification to the contract and still be, have that still be. That's, in other words, the new circumstances justify the modification. Again, just to touch on the UCC, under the UCC between merchants, modifications can be made without the need to find new consideration as long as that modification was made in good faith. And then there's a definition of good faith at this link that you can check out here. Well, what happens if you just make a bad deal? Can you go back to court and get some remedy? No. Courts do not police the sufficiency of the consideration. They just care that there is some. They don't care if you made a bad deal. Okay, the answer to this slide is promissory estoppel. Promissory estoppel is a substitute for a contract that has valid consideration. If one person is missing consideration, maybe what the court will do is find that in fairness, since they relied on the other person's promise and changed their position and kind of went out and spent money and did things in reliance, courts may sometimes out of equity enforce that deal because of the reliance. Promissory estoppel is quasi-contract. That's a fancy word for basically meaning sort of contract. It's recovery off the contract. There is no contract, but the court is finding an equitable reason to force the person who made the promise into complying with that promise. The next topic is accord and satisfaction. Imagine you have a huge utility bill and you haven't paid in a long time, and you call them up and say, hey, I'll pay you 10% on the dollar if you accept that. And they say, yes, we will. That's called an accord and satisfaction. That's a special type of agreement where somebody is essentially modifying the existing contract and accepting less, and it's a new contract. So that is valid. As long as there had been a dispute between the parties with respect to the contract and an agreement to compromise the dispute rather than sue, that may be a valid accord and satisfaction where somebody is bound to accept the less amount. So I used to always tell students they could write on disputed issues, they could write on the check, this is accord and satisfaction, and if accepted, if it's actually paid, and you know that the other side was aware of that writing of accord and satisfaction, that is binding. So you can actually pay less on your bills as long as you meet those circumstances. A guarantee is binding, even though there may be no consideration, and that's the idea that somebody is promising to answer for the debts of another. So some of you may have guarantors on your student loans. Some of you may have had a guarantor on a house. Even though that guarantor received nothing in exchange, they are legally bound, as we know from Susie Orman, who constantly harps on this issue. Never be a guarantor for somebody, because you can be legally bound for their debts even though you receive nothing in exchange. Here's the requirements for a guarantee to be valid. Okay, let's look at some examples here. When Henrietta returned John's lost dog, Toby, John promised to pay Henrietta $50 for her efforts. Is there consideration? No. No consideration. It was a gift promise. Henrietta had already returned the dog. So she didn't return the dog based upon the promise. In other words, the promise wasn't factored into her decision to return the dog. It just so happened that she returned it and then he made the promise. That's a gift. That's no consideration. Notice that if Henrietta went out and spent the money that she was going to receive, and then there might be an argument for promissory estoppel in that case. Let's try this one. Gloria Van Fleet had a 5-year contract. She did really well in the contract, so they want to increase her salary. Can they do that? Is that a binding contract? Yes. If Gloria, if they actually rip up the old contract and form a new one, that's totally binding. That's rescission. That's great. Could they simply modify the old one? Probably not. They probably need to start from scratch and do a new contract. Hopefully the crossword puzzle that you're going to be doing for this week will help reinforce these terms. This is a little trickier area, but I hope you're getting the grasp of it.